It is a real delight to welcome Anubhav. Anubhav is a very old friend of mine and erstwhile political rivals, now intellectual comrade. But I'll stick to the bio he sent us. So Anubhav Sengupta is currently teaching in Manipal Center for Humanities, Manipal, Karnataka. He received his doctorate degree from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi in 2017. For completion of his PhD thesis, he was awarded the SYLFF Fellowship. His areas of research interest are studies in subjectivity, political sociology of movements, Marxism and politics. So his paper today is titled Bhabo practice koro on politicization and mobilisation in communist politics. So, Anubhav.
Am I audible? Okay. First thing first, I must say that I forgot to actually translate and put it in a bracket that, so it was not like Bengali parochialism that I was trying to prove a point or sort of a pull a stunt also. So 2-3 very quick comments about this presentation I think I should do. The very first one is this, that this paper particularly doesn't explore the art or aesthetic when it comes to Ritwik Ghatak. So rather what it does, it actually takes the political document, one that he wrote in 1954, and sending it to the Politburo, saying that the CPI, Communist Party of India, needs to have a very different take on culture. So art here for me a kind of a instrument which I will use in order to think about certain things regarding philosophy and politics. Okay. Now, having said that, the second comment is this, that one part of it I have been working, I think, for 10 years, in the sense like I have been trying to do it since MPhil. A kind of a project to think subjectivity without a subject, which I'll come to what I mean by that. Every time I do it and I think I have solved the problem. Within 1 year, I believe that I haven't done it, and it is going on. And this is another attempt, and I'm sure sometime I'll figure out it hasn't worked out as well. So that's the thing. The third point is this. This is accidental, kind of a on Ritwik Ghatak, why Ritwik Ghatak is this particular document. I remember this happened because on this very same stage, and I think Shomiko really organized a panel on Ritwik Ghatak, and Shoma was speaking about something, and I had a discussion about it regarding in one movie when Ritwik Ghatak is talking about communist movement via a dialogue between three Naxalite at that time, that is of a 1960s, 60s, 70s context, and what coming about it, that his commitment to communist movement and communist politics. So that's the more or less couple of comments. Third point is that if you have read the abstract, I move little away towards the end from those ethnographic snippets and all that we can talk about if there are questions later. Rather, I'm fascinated with there are certain things that is coming up since that have been coming up since yesterday's also discussion that happened on after between Bhabo and Shomodi in Bhabo's presentation, and very interestingly, and with which I'll start my paper, is this particular discussion right now that happened, which thanks to say that it has already been opened up. This question of elements and then how those elements are coming together. Okay, so what I do is that particular quote that right now that Shomiko was talking about, to translate it very simply, that think and practice thinking. Okay, and I have always been very amazed by this particular line, think and practice thinking. Why practice? And it could just be think and think more. It could be quite a few opinions, quite a few options are open. But why the word practice? Okay. So in this presentation, I take that word very seriously. That's the point, in a sense, like I will take that word very seriously, and I will try to sort of read this particular document that Ritwik Ghatak wrote and kind of I'll try to read it. And it's a kind of a work in progress sort of a thing. If you want to think, it is not even a project right now because Shomik said and then I started thinking about it. And so these are some thoughts and some arguments I'll try to make. And towards the end, I'll try to engage with certain questions that already have come up. How to think about a revolution, which came up yesterday, and how to think about this particular combination, how to think about newness, and so on and so forth. So very quickly, I will talk about a particular project that I am talking about, subjectivity without a subject, or a movement of consciousness. This came about, or this has come up in the context of Althusser writing in 1950s and 1960s. And this is a project that later Allenby will turn that this is what quote unquote we've been given by Althusser this particular project, how to think movement of consciousness without a subject. Like it is not Anubhav thinking. It is without that subject. How can we think of the question of subjectivity? That a person, only somebody becomes conscious. A man, the idea of a centrality of somebody having a consciousness. How can we think about consciousness, say in communist movement, in terms of mass consciousness? How we were going to think of a mass consciousness where there is no centrality of this person, that person, and so on and so forth. So that's the problematic. And that is exactly what I've been trying to I've been engaging for something. Now, I'll begin with, instead of leaving it open like this, I'll begin with the very definition of practice that Althusser gives. Okay, so Althusser is writing, quote, "We are thus naturally led to conceive of social practices not as acts or simple activities, but as process." Now, this word process is important. Okay, that is, as a set of material, ideological, theoretical, and human elements sufficiently well adapted to each other for their reciprocal action to produce a result that modifies the initial given. Okay, now earlier I used to like it. Now I'm getting a little wary of this language. So if it's fine, if it's fine. To put it very simply, for me it is important what are the elements, because that is how I do a very point by point reading of Ritwik Ghatak. So in a practice, there are material, ideological, theoretical, and human elements. And we'll see about this, how to think about this combination. How these elements can come together, and can we think of a sort of a subjectivity without a subject, or in other words, movement of consciousness. So that's the project here. So, but there are a couple of things here we need to, three things actually we need to kind of pay attention to. The first is that practice is always social. There is no sort of individual practice. Precisely because of the moment you are bringing together other elements like theoretical, ideological, and so on and so forth, those are all quote-unquote socially produced and socially reproduced. So whatever it is, if we are talking about a practice is always social. Okay, practice is always an intervention. That is another important point. That practice modifies something. It cannot be that. So practice always has to begin with something, and then that beginning will change with the intervention of the practice. So that's the second point. And the third point is the definition of this consciousness, and how he writes. People's capacity to receive and store perception of the real and anticipate them as well. So that is the definition of another consciousness we need to sort of keep in mind within the broader category of movement of consciousness. People's capacity to receive and store perception of the real and anticipate them as well. Now to put it this way, in Althusser there are mainly three practices. The first practice is like say economic practices. You can understand like if there is a material world, the labor is sort of invested on that material world in order to produce and reproduce your condition of living and so on and so forth. That's the economic practice. I'm putting very it's wrong the way I'm putting. I must say it's more complex, but the second point would be like say political ideological practices. That way, how you intervene, in a revolutionary politics, how a party intervenes and then basically mobilize them. How the ideology I'll come, how the ideology actually works, and then basically how you make them conscious towards a revolutionary project. So that's the second part, that of a political ideological. And finally, there is a theoretical practice. Now, theoretical practice is a peculiar practice. For one reason is this: theoretical practice never intervenes into something. It never intervenes in the reality. It changes nothing. It is a peculiar practice under which basically you have some ideas, and on that idea there will be a theoretical operation, and thereby it will become a concept, and within that conceptual framework, basically knowledge will be produced. But that knowledge never comes back to the world in order to intervene directly. Okay, that is an important point. So then how things are going to get changed? Say for example, if Marx has written already Capital, and so how capital is going to change the world, but it is important, right? Capital is the sort of a Bible of the masses, but and then if the capital is knowledge, how it is going to sort of intervene? Now this is where my point is that Althusser sort of gets into trouble, and it's not I'm saying. Jacques Rassier, he severely criticized Althusser in one point of time, saying that what Althusser is doing, he is securing position for himself. He basically, because he is a philosopher, he wants to sort of establish his position because he is through and through, otherwise it is theoreticism. That is his sort of an argument. Okay. So what does it mean? So in Althusser's schema, what comes out to be over the course of time that philosophy is a class struggle in theory. Okay, in theory never intervenes in political ideological struggle, that is in reality. That means theory comes via philosophy in order and go to the sort of a political ideological struggle. To put it again very simply, so if you are a philosopher, you carry the political ideological struggle in the sites of university. There the true knowledge is produced, and as a philosopher, then you come back and fight it inside the Communist Party. According to him, that he was doing a sort of a class struggle in philosophy, and vis-a-vis, he is also fighting a kind of a battle inside the Communist Party as well, right? But as I already mentioned, there is a problem in this. There are no people as such. There are no masses. There are no questions of class consciousness. There is no understanding, which E.P. Thompson is also leveling against him, that there is no understanding of history. There is no question of consciousness. Masses have disappeared. And thereby Rassier says that it is a weird revisionism that Althusser has produced and basically gave the whole power back to the party. It is the party which is going to organize. It is the party which will take the people out of their false consciousness and then basically mobilize them towards the revolution. And Althusser is sketchy. All through and through, it's difficult to understand why Althusser is so sketchy when it comes to any questions of political ideological struggle. And I do believe Althusser had a problem there. The problem is he was not being able to conceptualize a sort of a political ideological position where he doesn't have to compromise his anti-humanism. That is the important part. Like how you think of subjectivity, consciousness, without sort of a compromising your position on movement of consciousness and subjectivity without a subject, right? But somewhere, I believe he really tried once, and that is where art kind of comes in here. If you guys go back and then for Marx, if you read this one small essay on Piccolo Teredo, right? So he's writing about this one production that has happened by this Piccolo Teredo, which has been lambasted by the Parisian critic by saying that it is simple melodramatic, and he wants to defend that. So what is the plot? Plot is simple. Really, the first act, he's telling us that nothing happens. You just get to see a lot of people. You get to see the working class on stage. You get to see some circus happening, but no event happens. Then, in other acts, however, there is a tragic event developing. What kind of a tragic event they are developing? That there is a girl who is being pursued by a particular person, and that person basically forces himself on her and kisses. The father sees that. Father comes. Father kills that person, and then father goes to jail. And on the last day, when the daughter and father are meeting, and father is trying to convince her of the fact that he did it to protect her. Then she says that I don't want anybody's protection. If the world is like this, then I better go out there in the world. If I have to sell my body, I'll sell my world, but I'm not going to get trapped here. I'm not going to get trapped. Now, what Althusser argues is this: the great effect of this particular production, according to Althusser, that basically it produces two temporality on stage. On the one hand, there is a temporality where nothing happens. That is of millions working class are coming and going. There is no event. There is nobody says anything that why it is happening, why they are coming on stage, and so on and so forth. And another temporality is this temporality of tragedy, which is full of dialectics, full of melodrama, and so on and so forth. Now, his argument is the Parisian critique, they basically took this particular tragic drama happening on stage as melodrama, which is melodrama, but forward, the other part of the story, another temporality where nothing happens. And Althusser's point is this is the condition in which movement of consciousness can happen. What does it mean? He says the breadth understanding of alienation is precisely you have to understand in that way. That is, there are things happening when nothing happens. There are 2-3 acts when everything happens very quickly with a lot of events, lot of conflict, and so on and so forth. But nobody tells you how those connect together, right? You don't know why we were seeing some people coming on stage and going out and so on and so forth, and then we see these 3 people. What is their connection? We don't know that. And he says that Brechtian alienation effect needs to be understood in this structure. You basically give the sort of the spectator this one time, that is the long time, empty time where nothing happens, which according to him or many other theorists also is the time of the capital, right? It is the time of the global capital. That is an empty time in that way. And on the other hand, if anybody interested, this particular argument actually Partha Chatterjee brings out very interestingly in Political Society. That interestingly means it's very easily understandable. Like it. Anyway, so that's the empty time. And then your life, where a lot of things are happening and you are caught there, and thereby you are not being able to see the connection that your life, this sort of a lowly, oppressed, exploited life, there is a larger connection with that time, because you are oblivious of that time. You don't get to see the disconnect. And because you don't get to see the disconnect, you never really make the connection, which this girl, when she says that if I have to live like this, I better transcend this life and see what is out there instead of getting trapped in this particular place. I'll move on. And that is what he kind of argues, that is the beginning of movement of consciousness. Problem is this, he never comes back to it. It is in for Marx. By the time you are going 1969, he is writing Ideological State Apparatus, that famous essay. Now, every subject or consciousness as a subject, you, me, each of us, with our consciousness and so on and so forth, as a subject, it is always ideological. There is no beyond ideology, right? So the point is something is that he says that even in communist society there will be ideology. There is, life cannot be lived without a particular relationship with reality, and that reality is, that particular connection has to be always an ideological relation. So his one famous line of it is that it is the relationship between your relationship with the condition of your living, the real relation. That is the imaginary relationship with the real relation is basically is the ideology is that imagination. Ideology produces that imagination. So you are in JNU, you become left. Okay? You go out, you become something else, and then you say that no, because during left, this is bad, that is bad, and so on and so forth. And so outside you have a different imagination of relationship. You say that no, that was a life which is kind of a utopian time in JNU, real life is different. This particular imagination that keeps changing, that according to him, that imaginary relationship that you are kind of connecting to, that according to him is always ideological, right? So now suddenly consciousness doesn't have So consciousness almost, what Sandor was saying, is trapped, you know. Consciousness is trapped, but only thing is that nothing is getting shattered. But you are really happy about it because perhaps you are peacefully living, or you are not peacefully living, but you are living nonetheless. As a consistently there is a continuity in your life. So if this is where we are, and we don't want to kind of think on in terms of subject and in terms of humanism and so on and so forth, then should we then abandon the question of movement of consciousness or subjectivity without a subject? And the point is this: somewhere yesterday, where Bhabo and Bhabo, both of them were, I'm saying. Point is that those are very important questions. We cannot go back to the Marxist dogmatism of simply uttering certain things that no party will come and intervene and thereby there will be a false consciousness to a true consciousness. I think those debates, that is not the way. The challenges and new challenges have come up. The new thought has come up that way. And if you are trying to think this particular problem of movement of consciousness within a parameter of Marxism, then you have to think it differently. You cannot really say that, okay, I'm not going to listen to what Shomo has to say. Shomo's position is different. Shomo is not Marxist. But I believe these problematics are very much now part of the communist politics itself. You know? And it has been, historically it has been. Right? So this is what I am sort of trying to enter. And I'll read it out. It won't take me, I hope, more than 15 minutes, and the rest of it we can discuss separately. So let's see. Let's read the document, and let's just see. Read the document, of course, on my terms, and let's just see, can we think of movement of consciousness at all after reading this particular document? And I'll read it out because I have just written it, and so it is not there in my head very well said manner. So my presentation, however, is not to resolve these appearances in Althusserianism. That has to be a separate investigation. My interest lies in the problematic that, as we have just seen, Althusser never adequately poses art, politics, consciousness, despite taking and all, which I'll very quickly talk about. So this is where we are. Seemingly only movement of consciousness arrived at art, but then Althusser didn't tell us anything. Okay, except that art is not ideological, completely ideological, but however it is absolutely not theoretical. Okay, so art doesn't have any emancipatory potential as such, but there seemingly some consciousness is there, the question of consciousness, and we'll go there. Okay. My interest lies in the problematic that, as we have just seen, Althusser never adequately poses the question about art, politics, and consciousness. I also take recourse to Althusser because I am of the opinion the method adopted by Ritwik Ghatak in this document has remarkable parallel with method of the former. How strange it may sound, I shall show how Ritwik Ghatak is pleading for an assigned place for artistic practice as a separate practice inside the domain of the party and its political ideological struggle. I hope to demonstrate how he poses a problem of organization in general, which enables him to pose the problematic that Althusser never does. Now, this is where I'll aim my presentation. That I'm trying to sort of think of organization here. Like there is no contradiction at all, but different ways of thinking, I believe. We were thinking more in terms of operation yesterday, like the ascetic effect of separate yourself from, and I'll try to sort of engage, if possible. For me, organization is that, when I'm talking about organization, how to think about organization, and it is not just political organization in itself. That is the point. So that is basically the argument. But before that, what I'll do is that I'll try to establish that how Ritwik Ghatak is showing that how art is also a practice. The way theoretical practice is there, political ideological practice is there should also be this acknowledgement that art in itself is a practice and it's a separate practice from all the other practices. Okay, so that is what will come one by one. I'll try to do that. Ghatak declares that, in quote, it has to be unequivocally declared that the problem of culture is basically the problem of organization at the levels of the party, the platform, and art. This particular declaration is deceptively simple. A closer look will readily raise a set of questions. What is culture? What exactly is the relationship between culture and art? What is organization of art? How problem of organization in art resembles or differs from the problem of organization at the level of the party and platform. I shall begin with the first two questions. One can make two contradictory statements here on Ghatak's understanding of the relationship between art and culture at the same time. One can say art is simply the subset of culture, and I must admit such argument can be substantiated from the text. However, I contend a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between culture and art may as well be found in the text. I argue, in this reading, culture is a process, as is the domain of economy, polity, etc. He tries to establish culture as a relatively autonomous domain. This, in turn, enables him to argue for specificity of artistic practices. So, instead of just thinking that art is just a part of the culture, my argument very simply is that he is trying to think first culture as a domain, like the way you have economy, for example. And if he can establish that, then he can establish art as a practice specific to that domain. The way production economy has a specific practices, there will be art as a specific practices to that particular domain. Okay. So let's just see culture as separate domain. And here it's very interesting. Actually, Bhabo in the morning also was talking about two ways of thinking culture. I think we can talk later, but it is another way. Ghatak is actually trying to taking little bit that very primordial identitarian idea of culture, but at the same time he's trying to keep it open. That openness, like I also talked about, but from a different idea of it. And later we can actually talk. I believe here also he's trying to kind of having this emancipation point. We'll see. Ghatak brings Lenin into discussion to argue culture is a process. Culture is natural development of stores of knowledge that society has historically accumulated. Each epoch, under the dictatorship of a particular class, develops its own modes of knowledges and expression. However, it is only achieved by reshaping. He writes, and I quote, that culture moves in an unending line is a natural development of previous cultures. Culture is reshaped again and again by the class which is the historical leader of the epoch. One very significant event happens here, and we must note it. Ghatak interprets Lenin's understanding of culture as the natural development in a very different manner. He interprets the natural development as an unending line. And I quote, culture moves in an unending line. So from natural development to unending line, to changing that, interpret that natural development that never ends. That's a very interesting shift that happens. Why replace natural development with the expression of unending line? The answer comes in the following line, and I quote, dividing culture into periods is too mechanistic. I argue this move is rather significant. If political economic changes do not immediately reflect in culture, then temporal order of culture is different from the former. In other words, Ghatak is claiming relative autonomy for culture as process. This claim, however, is neither rhetorical nor ideological. It is a structural claim. He writes, we should remember that culture is one of the remote superstructures of economics. Remote here doesn't imply a weakling, but the absence of a vulgar determinism. Political economic shifts do impact culture, however, the impact is realized and expressed in and through the process that culture is. So it takes its own time, let's put it as simply as that. If tomorrow there is a revolution, that doesn't mean that there will be a revolution in culture the day after. Or so there is a different temporality in and through which culture moves. So if you can think of the first one, so initially I talked about an empty time. He talked about it. Then he talked about a full time. If you read Ghatak, in my interpretation, Ghatak is kind of trying to talk about a time of culture, which is a very different culture, and he keeps on going and saying, okay, so what is now the relationship between art and culture, right? That I started with. Now, Now to give the answer to the question on art, culture and their relationship, culture as a process works on and reshapes heritage. Ghatak writes, culture reshapes past heritage only by reshaping the past and carrying it to its logical conclusion. Can culture come in the service of the working class? And heritage, in our case, is national heritage. With the introduction of national heritage as the raw material of culture in real context, the relationship between art and culture is established. Art works on the same object that culture as a process without end also does, that is national heritage. And please note the raw material part, that during practice involves always a raw material on which the other elements come together to work on it and then intervene in the element. So this is where the raw material comes. Former, however, derives its unity from the latter by committing to carry forward and reshape national heritage. Without such a commitment, it is impossible to imagine any art at all. In other words, as we shall shortly see, even communist art cannot qualify as an art unless inscribed in this cultural superstructure. Okay? So I now quickly draw your attention to the definition of practice I outlined before. I think I may be justified at this stage to pursue Ghatak's understanding of art as artistic practice. We know now that art has a raw material, that is national heritage, as do all practices. But what are the ideological, theoretical and human elements? For this, we need to pay attention to the problem of organization at the level of party and platform. The artistic practice and ideological element, let's just see. The question of ideology comes on the heels of art's commitment to carrying forward and reshaping heritage. For a communist artist, besides her commitment to artistic practices, it also means her political commitment to the party's slogan for National Democratic Front. At the level of creativity, the artist's commitment to both tasks must be weaved seamlessly, and Ghatak sees no contradiction between these two tasks. In fact, he cannot conceive of the communist art without the unity of artistic and political ideological practices. He writes, are these two tasks incompatible? Is there any contradiction between these two? No. This division is completely notional. In reality, both tasks in one and the same artwork. Without one, the work doesn't remain a communist work. Without the other, it is impossible to imagine any art at all. Okay, so if this is the ideological part, then we have a theoretical part to the art as a practice. We should have, right? If you do so theoretical part. We have already come across how central heritage is to the artistic practices. It is a vague word, and that's has been used rather abruptly and then dropped in the later half of the document. Still, I draw attention to the following quote, and I quote, culture reshapes heritage. Heritage presupposes study, knowledge and learning. We should remember these words. Heritage now appears to be more than an object of art and culture, but precondition of its existence is theoretical practice. Heritage doesn't just magically appear and become object of art. I am not in a position to explore this fascinating thought of his any further. However, what I draw attention to is the theoretical component that Ghatak brings to the artistic practices. This theory, however, is absolutely specific to art and artists. It is not knowledge of art that Althusser proposes. Ghatak proposes an academy, a platform where communist artists, artist sympathizer and the common artist can come together to discuss theories and appropriate practice. For him, the common artist means who are not communist artists, who are outside the fold of the movement, but who are also great professional artists. So the common artist, when he uses it in that sense. The theory and knowledge for Ghatak mostly concerns the question of form and mode of production, a strange echo of Althusser's insistence on form of dialectics or production of concept. This is also the place where heritage will be conserved and studied. It is important to understand this academic's theoretical practice is outside, that is autonomous, of the political ideological practice of the party. He divides the art world into three broad categories of artists according to their attitude: professional, semi-professional and amateurs. Ghatak's organizational problem here is to find a united front in terms of, he doesn't agree with the word front, but just provisionally. united mass front with the first two categories. However, he alerts among artists there cannot be any fronts. There can only be federation based on the principle of self-determination. To put it very simply, as a group, if you want, you can leave the federation. That's the simple point. Nobody can force you and say that no, you have to stay because you have agreed to all the common minimum point here. Everybody has their self-determination, and according to him, that's the main principle of any democratic function. He unequivocally declares that the mass for cultural front is the artist who have achieved a certain mastery, knowledge, and understanding of the art. Even if their ideological attitude is not in line with the party, Ghatak's contention is that is exactly what is the task of the communist artist. In the process of being in the same platform with minimum agreement on principles, that is the humanism, he says that that is our call of our time, that is in humanism. While the communist artists learn from the common artist from skills to form of expression, later tries to convince the former through practice and bring them under the ideology of the party. Ghatak provides meticulous roadmap for building this federation. Assessing merit and demerit of such is not the purview of this paper. So on the one hand, in the academic, theoretical practices take stocks of heritage, learn, study. In the federation, a practice develops that helps the communist artists to learn newer forms and expression. Armed with theory and practice, Ghatak believes the communist artists can lead the common artists and mobilize them under the slogan of party's democratic form. And I quote, "We must mobilize artists in our organization and constantly strive to show these artists by example what should be the function of art today." I believe we can now provisionally conclude that Ghatak has assigned the art, unlike Althusser, the status of practice with specific effectivity. Now, effectivity is precisely that. Like every practice will be somewhere or other be alter something. It will alter the initial point, and then basically there will be an end point. Those 2 points are different. So always there is an effectivity. Economy practice will have its own effectivity, and so on and so forth. Our conclusion is, however, only provisional at this stage. A practice must involve sufficient adaptation of the elements to change what was initially given. And to define that sufficiently, we must locate its effectivity, that how it intervenes in reality. Ghatak writes, and I quote, "An artist's job is to bring forth collective feeling. This gathering and bringing forth of collective feeling is a specialized function. The artist looks at life in a special way and gives expression to his thought through a special effort." Unquote. I believe this is exactly the moment Althusser and Ghatak kind of collides. They meet, but only to go exactly the opposite direction. They meet when Ghatak insists on the materiality of this special way of looking. It is no mental faculty that anyone is born with. It is also not the result of contemplation. It is not thought. It is a result of prolonged effort. So much so that artistic content and form come only through such effort. And to remain creative is to renew the process of cultivating this special way of looking after each creation. In fact, he compares this looking with that of an engineer, economist, or trade unionist. Ghatak continues, once through their faculty, artists give form to the content, they utter and become distinctive. This almost philosophical utterance of the word utter should bring to our mind Althusser quoting Pascal in that famous essay of ideology and ideological state apparatus, "Kneel down, move your lips in prayer, and you will believe." Latter is trying to show how a subject is born not because of ideas, but because ideas are inserted into material action and practices. In other words, kneel, utter the words of your prayer, and as an individual you will be a believer. It almost appears Ghatak is saying the same thing. An individual becomes an artist, becomes distinctive, the moment she utters the agony and the suffering that she is experiencing in and through her special way of looking. But then Ghatak adds a small sentence that breaks him away from Althusser. And I quote, "This agony and this suffering is understood in its collectivity in order to be uttered." Althusser's ideology interprets an individual as subject. Ideology is individuality. For Ghatak, the artist as a subject exists only in collectivity. Individuals' agony or suffering, in order to be uttered, that thus to be art, must be collectivizing. Now, I'll come to the question of this, what I say. This is, I'm coming towards the end of it. I'm trying to think of this idea of organization so far that we encountered in a very, I'll say, simplistic way. We can talk about it, that how it is important, how art should be organized differently from the political organization, so on and so forth. But I believe in Ghatak there is a much layered understanding of organization, and that is what I'm trying to sort of how do I put it? I'm trying to sort of grapple it here. And it's a provisional thought, great to get in discussion. If such is the effectivity of art, and Ghatak stops there, he has not said anything new. Peter Beshe, following Althusser's lead, has established how an art is a strange mirror. He more or less reaches similar conclusion, albeit with different terms and politics. Ghatak's singular focus on the problem of organization and the continuous return to the question of politics allows him to turn even the subjectivity in art as a problem of organization. He subtly gives organization a much larger meaning that readily accessible in the text. The collectivizing tendency of the art or artist relating his emotion to the general in order to capture collective feeling are also problems of organization. The feeling or emotion captured through the special way of looking, which in itself part of a special and continuous effort, is just the beginning. I would like to elaborate on this organizational process step by step, keeping myself close to his work. Ghatak fortunately gives the example from a production of drama, making it easier to keep him in parallel to Althusser. We shall see the journey from emotion to ideas to consciousness in the act of creation. Okay. Movement of consciousness and the act of creation. The first moment, and I'm quoting, the dramatist never undertakes to write about something to say, consciously say. The dramatist never undertakes to write about something unless and until he consciously wants to say something. So his point is that there is always a sort of a conscious urge to say something. I think the important point in this line is to note the emphasis on consciousness. The uttering we encountered earlier is not only premised on the tendency to collectivizing one's agony and suffering. To utter is also to capture suffering or agony beyond emotional content consciously as an idea. That also requires immediate communication. I know it's a bit long sentence, bad editing. The uttering we encountered earlier is not only premised on the tendency to collectivizing one's agony and suffering. To utter is also to capture suffering or agony beyond emotional content consciously as an idea that requires immediate communication. Consciousness at this stage is merely a vision which has drawn his or her focus, and I quote, he becomes aware of its vague urge in himself and he becomes inspired. Second moment, in the next stage, and I quote, he starts to invent things and to heap up lies to this truth. In this process of translating the idea in human terms, it gets diffused, becomes dilated, spills over. It doesn't remain idea anymore. It becomes an issue or issues, at the center of which storms rage. Storms of emotion. So basically the idea that you have the plot, then you bring the father, the mother, they are fighting, so you are trying to tell that story. Very interestingly, please note this particular word, that in human terms, so idea is being brought to a kind of a human terms. You are trying to engage people, you are translating your idea into human terms, okay? When you are plotting your story or drama. Now we have the second stage of movement of artist consciousness. Also the first stage of what I have called organization. That is a process of organizing. The organization here is peculiar to the effect that it is moving towards a diffuse state. The way I understand his usage of words such as dilated or diffuse is to understand the process of collectivizing where an individual's ideas pressing upon an individual start getting organized on a collective plane. The collective plane is the characters that are chalked out, contradictions that are inscribed, and lies that are told to release the idea as a dramatic plot. The organization of an idea, as he says, at the human level. We must note here particular agency awarded to the idea. It is the idea which mostly stays hidden or comes to surface, just to disappear, is the determining element in this process. It is not the individual artist. He writes, and I quote, his basic idea constantly motivates all action, moves everything. However, it is also true, Ghatak gives a strange but quite apparent Hegelian description of the next stage. According to him, all human elements in the plot, in their contradiction, now synthesize on a higher level. The idea is now qualitatively differentiated as the artist experiences the antagonism in his own imagination and in the process lights up the idea as a theme content. So coming back to that very Hegelian idea that we know is a qualitative synthesis, the qualitative leap, the quantitative coming together and then the qualitative leap, which Althusser is like, for him it is blasphemous. So is it so? Like then is Ghatak still is actually talking in a Hegelian language? Moving on. Without a shadow of doubt, this process can never be claimed to be movement of consciousness. This is exactly what Althusser will argue, ideological consciousness at play in eventful full time. Idea doesn't really displaces the subject, all it does takes its place. However, Ghatak is also not done yet. This process described above just gives the theme content. It is only the raw material upon which now another artistic operation must happen in order to present it. It is purely physical aspect of the artistic practice. And it is his word, physical aspect. I will just simply provide a lengthy quote. How does he define it? The reviewer surveys the field, weighs, criticizes, accepts, comments on the theme content. I argue, while in the hand of the dramatist, the theme content is a subject of emotion, for the regisseur, it is the same theme content is the object of artistic practices. He subjects it to theoretical reflection, inserts compare and contrast with respect to the artistic standard of time, and critically evaluates its forms and content. More importantly, he adequately and sufficiently ties them on the other with all physical processes described above. Ghatak insists on the creativity of a regisseur, and this emphasis is quite logical. Regisseur is the organizer par excellence. This doesn't imply regisseur is above the process of assembling and presentation. He is also constrained by the material condition as well. He gives the example of Shambhu staging David's play Roktogorovi, where according to him the argument is this, like Roktogorovi of course contained a very intense understanding idea, but it was idealistic. But by the time Shambhu actually is producing that particular play, he basically gave it a progressive interpretation to it, but Shambhu changed nothing, not a single line. It was the organization of the play that gave it that idealistic content was sort of removed and a materialistic basis was given. That's the idea. And he writes very nicely. I don't have the quote. It is this question of organizing I began by saying Althusser never posed. I believe it is evident now the problem of organization has a more complex structure in Ghatak's document. One organization is nested inside another organization. At the same time, organization 1 imposes limit condition on organization 2. The organization of theme content, it resides inside the organization of regisseur. The regisseur resides in the organizing principle of federation and platform, and finally the party. What each organization has as its object is a gap. For example, at the stage of writing a drama, it is the gap between arch and utterance. Next, it is the gap between the idea and what dramatist wants to say. Similarly, we can go on to add another gap between what an artist wants to say consciously and form in which she says. This is where communist artists, just like regisseur, will come in to organize this gap by correct artistic practices with the form appropriate to the historical moment. And thereby, the common artist will be convinced to come under quote-unquote party, the fold of party. To return to Althusser's understanding of Brechtian alienation effect, the girl resembles the poet for Ghatak to the extent structurally their experience is full of fantastic confrontation. However, it is an ideological time because it is oblivious of real condition of living. Althusser sees a possibility of movement of consciousness once the disconnect is presented on the stage, and disconnect has an alienation effect. On the other hand, Ghatak, of course, conceives the disconnect itself as the object of artistic practices. However, not necessarily as an object of creativity, but that of process of organization integral to artistic practices. So I'm trying to sort of make a distinction. I'm not saying that art is about any gap, but what I'm trying to say is that art and whatever its object, because artistic practices are also integral to art, according to him, that practice has this gap as its object on which it is basically working. So I'm making a kind of a separation. This separation that is between the art and artistic practices, albeit in this dialectical relationship between process of creativity and a concept of organization inherent to art, allows Ghatak to conceive similar movement of consciousness that Althusser could barely gesture towards. This also allows Ghatak to carve a specificity for the art as a practice, but at the same time link it up with political ideological practices, theoretical practices, etc. And most importantly, the logical conclusion, a phrase he uses few times, of the movement of consciousness internal to artistic practice is to emerge as a condition in and through which objective condition of the masses finds the subjective response. So the final moment, basically, if you are staging a play, it's basically a play that kind of produce an effect. Its effectivity on the masses is this, that masses think that, oh, okay, this is what I was vaguely feeling. That is vaguely feeling about the world, about the objective condition. So this particular connection that he wants to. So what I say that can mass have conscious, and I'm quoting, remind them that one among them had risen and speaking, declaring what they were vaguely sensing. The words are new, but at the same time not new. The objective condition will find the subjective response. I propose Ghatak's ambition is just not to establish a correct relation between art and politics, but also grasp what could be the art of politics.
So a few questions before we. I have a question. Whatever I understood, I'll ask you something maybe later on. So I open the house to questions.
So, okay, Anubhav, very, very rich and complex set of moves that you make here. So, just to take some of the key texts that you look at, Althusser's that brief but brilliant review of the play, Ecolo Theatre, but also Mother Courage, two stuff. So, and you're right, that's a rare place where he speaks of something like consciousness. But of course, for him, consciousness is a problem in the sense that there is no transparency to this consciousness. Consciousness is something which the play itself produces, the problem of the consciousness. And the remarkable thing that he says is that the performance produces, or the play produces the problem of consciousness, and the spectator is included in the problem. So the spectatorial consciousness is not taken as something given, because the conventional realistic demarcation is that everything that's happening on the stage is the production of, or the practice of fiction, but fiction also raising ideological and philosophical and political questions. And all of this is synthesized and eventually either aesthetically enjoyed or rejected, and also carried forward cognitively by the spectatorial subject, which is a kind of consciousness. But Althusser does not accept this demarcation. In that sense, he goes over the proscenium, empirical proscenium distance, and creates not at all an identification, but something which is actually a greater alienation, which is the alienation of this very theatre space within the historical space, or the social space of history. So in a sense, the theatre space is the very pure distance, which itself is the internal distance of society from itself. So society does not have a grasp over its own logic. And the spectator, in a sense, carries this problem of the consciousness, not consciousness. It carries this difficulty of consciousness. So in a way, what it does is to raise, which is a central problem of art, raise the problem of art as orientation. Does art disorient you like in avant-garde, like in modernist, Dadaist, and all kinds of experimental performance, or does, like Brecht would want, art particularly orient you in a time of disorientation? So is art a specific and special disorientation, like transgressive avant-garde art, or is art actually that specific strategy of orientation through fiction in a time of disorientation? That is what Brecht, for instance, in the morning, Bhabo was speaking about it, something like a rational, art is the only rational activity in a time of general irrationality. But Althusser makes that, complicates that, produces a complexity in that. By saying, yes, there is a kind of rationality in art, but it's not an optimistic rationality. Actually, the rationality is the raising of a question. The raising of the question of this disorientation, rather than orienting or disorienting. The simplistic opposition is now made into something far more complex. So, in that sense, it's the problem of thought, which is not merely the replication of ideology, but something which is a new problem or a new question for the orientation which art brings up. So that, I think, is a very remarkable point in Althusser, and I thank you for pointing out this text for that problem of consciousness. Now, when towards the second part, when you actually read to us Ritwik Ghatak's document, and it's fascinating that Ritwik Ghatak actually makes art the model for a kind of organization, and that culminates in the poet, who in a sense provides the template or the model or the figure for the political leader. So organization as a poetic organization. But now that is also interesting because in our own times, in a way, the model for the political leader comes from the corporate organization. Today we speak of prime ministers as CEOs. And in a communist vision, Ritwik Ghatak is speaking of the political leader or the poet as the template for the leader. So we can see in that sense this very interesting distinction. But in both cases, for the organization, you actually need something like a cipher, something like a palimpsest. And art provides that palimpsest, that beneath the apparent organization, which is political organization, there is the poetic organization. In the case of modern politics, it's the corporate organization. So that to me is very interesting. But again, that is precisely the kind of thing where the poetic consciousness is not a consciousness in the sense of something which is so you're right, it's not a subject. It's not a faculty. It's not even phenomenologically act of being in the world. It is none of that. It's already a particular kind of disorientation, a particular kind of problem of orientation. Because the poet is also providing a certain poetic response to a problem of disorientation and orientation. But the interesting thing is that it is not left to the poet. It's not left to the poet's singularity. At the same time, Ritwik Ghatak is providing a very systematic formula, a very systematic step-by-step, point-to-point development. So both these things are going together. So that is what I'm curious about. On the one hand, something like the poetic singularity, which is like an event, which is like the event which raises these questions of orientation and disorientation. On the other hand, there is something like a plan, a program. But between the program and the singularity, isn't there already again the return of the problem of the gap? The problem of a kind of leap. Sure, there is a program, and sure, there is discipline. And Ritwik Ghatak is completely right. But surely in Ritwik Ghatak's own work, and of course, his own work should not be made an excuse to criticize his theoretical idea. Both can stand on their own. So I'm perfectly aware of that. Nevertheless, the fact that there is discipline does not mean that the result, which is the fundamental meaning of practice, that it must have a result. That result actually comes out of the discipline. But at the same time, because the result is something which is in the nature of the event, does not mean that there is no discipline. Yeah. So there is no continuity between discipline and the result. But that's the interesting thing about practice. And in that sense, to go back to Althusser, practice is precisely heterogeneous. Practice is not simply the different practices. Practice in itself is a heterogeneous process.
Sure.
So in that sense, indeed, would art provide a kind of vanguard. Instead of the vanguard for the vanguard. Yeah. How would you think about this possibility?
The whole that certain parts of it I need to think more. But this orientation and disorientation part, that's because I mentioned this but I didn't elaborate on it. So in ideology, that collection, the way he is basically replying on art, Althusser is replying, and then Althusser is saying that art is not ideology. I never said that, but at the same point of view, art is not theory. That's all. Now, in between, as I said, some vague words and all, then he says that this Peter Meche, he's working on it, and so I'll ask you to read that article. So if we go to that article, there is this Peter Meche argument is that Tolstoy is not ideological. Tolstoy is showing there is an orientation in Tolstoy and so on and so forth. But then he uses this example of this strange mirror, right? That strange mirror is a mirror which actually showing something that mirror is not aware of. If we want to taking mirror as that structural idea, which is there in reading Capital also. So the point is something, because you are showing something that you cannot see, and when a spectator sees that the whole fact, there is a possibility of artistic or aesthetic effect can be thought there, which I think it's a good way to put, much easier way to put in that orientation and disorientation instead of thinking it in their binary. It's much better to perhaps think, and I absolutely agree with you, the orientation in itself produces that disorientation, and the disorientation is also required for that particular orientation. My point is that subject is absolutely agree that the subject has to be part of it, and subject in a sense in a very different way. The subject has to be part of it in that, and that's why they are not completely saying that art is a separate thing. They will not say that, because that ideological component is always there. So if I got him correctly, if I'm not intending, I'm a little skeptical about this point of discipline. I get it. The moment we are using the word organization, there will be a tendency to think it in terms of discipline. I get that. What I am trying to think of, and which was a very little part towards the end of it, I of course didn't. I'm kind of trying to think of a tunneling sort of a thing. What I'm trying to think is that the dramatist starts writing, and the dramatist, say for example, that Tolstoy, who basically has written something that he himself doesn't see that way as a dramatist. Now that particular organization that the dramatist has been able to do, after the director walks in, the director has that particular gap in hand. That is what he wants to reorganize. And there are other elements also, other elements that he keeps on talking about. So there is this second kind of organization. Now the point is that who is this director? What is his ideological position? Let's say it is the common artist. Now if it is the common artist, there needs to be a different kind of an intervention on that staging. So if Samumitra is not communist through and through, then basically you need to closely work with Samumitra in order to rearrange that particular, reorganize that particular orthography for the third time, and then produce a different kind of arrangement. I was thinking in that way, but I very provisionally. So I'm saying that it is this this idea of a continuously and a kind of a consciousness that he is saying, that idea and the consciousness, that sort of a being given different kind of a reorganization again and again. And I think that is all. But it has to be open, like, which is very important. I don't believe we can make the claim of, like, I'll be very skeptical. I think he will also be very skeptical that it has to be open in that particular way. That's what. But this orientation point, I think little more.
No, I agree with you that this discipline is not a discipline which takes anything to be completely mechanical or completely saturated formula or a program. But at the same time, this discipline is indeed a discipline of the problem rather than a discipline of something which is a form, like knowledge or consciousness. It's a discipline which is coming from a problem. It's a discipline which is coming from some sort of something which is already open. So open is not only at the end, open must also be at the beginning. The point of departure must be an open. Otherwise, the discipline will only be something which is entirely at the level of a ritual.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the open must actually be seen. So Rakta Karabi. So this is very interesting. Now you can say that Rakta Karabi is idealistic. That's one way of. But point is, Rakta Karabi is a problem.
Yeah.
So anyone who has dealt with the plays of Tagore knows that the plays of Tagore, whether they're idealistic or not idealistic, is a secondary question.
Yeah, and Ghatak saying he's that guy, like in that he has a lot of respect for.
That we know. But in the specific case of drama, in the history of Bengali drama, the basic problem of Tagore is the same as the problem of Mallarmé in Europe. That it is singular but unplayable because it has no dramaturgy. It is as if there is no historical model or consciousness. So it is indeed a problem of consciousness.
Okay, that's it.
In the sense of not a empirical consciousness, but a hypothetical consciousness, a dramaturgic consciousness. So for Tagore, there is no dramaturgic consciousness. Just like for Mallarmé, there is no dramaturgic consciousness. So when X person, Shambhumitra or whoever, comes in and does something, it is actually not vis-a-vis Rakta Karabi. It's vis-a-vis a kind of a point which begins with a leap.
Sir, can you elaborate a bit on this point of leap?
That's because when you take art through a certain object, certain historically given object, like a play, or like a theme, then that object exists as something which you can reinterpret in different versions, but the object as if remains constant. So you talk about Rakta Karabi and several productions of Rakta Karabi. You can also draw out something like a progressive or even an evolutionary schema for it. So as if from an idealistic to a crude materialistic to a kind of more evolved materialistic, a whole a final destination is reached. But that surely is not the only way to look at the history of art. So if you take Rakta Karabi, and Rakta Karabi first appears neither as idealistic or materialistic, but that it's unplayable, that it has no dramaturgy. What does it mean? It means, very practically, there is nothing for a director to go upon. There is nothing for a dramaturg to tell you that what kind of a model do we sink along, whether idealistic or materialistic or anything else, to play Rakta Karabi. There is no semiotic on stage, in scenography, in music to adopt when we do Rakta Karabi. Yeah, same problem with Stephen Mallarmé. The play is there, but you do not just know. You don't know on what basis to take a decision on, literally, this director word, regisseur, whatever. Someone who takes a decision on blocking, someone who takes a decision on composing. But you have nothing to go upon. to take a decision. So when you take a decision, then that decision has to come from something like a leap, something which is in the decision itself, rather than in an interpretation. So you can talk about Shambhumitra's interpretation, but only retrospectively. Shambhumitra, in a way, does produce a new history, not because he does Raktakarabi in a particular way, but because Raktakarabi's history begins with Shambhumitra, not with Raktakarabi of Tagore. Though, of course, you're right, and Ritwik Ghatak is right to point out that he doesn't change a single line. But that's the whole point, that's the newness. That's exactly what we were discussing in the earlier presentation. The newness does not lie in changing lines, in identifying empirical elements. The newness lies in keeping everything intact and yet indiscernibly a distinct new model consciousness, in your words, arises. In that sense, indeed, consciousness. Not a consciousness which is possessed by a subject, but a consciousness which is the result of something which is the practice itself. That is what I mean, by the leap.
Yeah, it's I don't know. I mean, again, I have to think. And certain things I am not even trained to understand right now. You were saying. It's very interesting, sir. Given the fact, like what you were saying, it's very easy to the fact that Taylor cannot be staged. Like Taylor cannot be staged. Through Ghatak, it's easier to. Right now, where I am, it's very easier for me to think like how it can still be possible. I'm understanding the in this way precisely because if you take it as a raw material, not defined, like the very capital first page definition of what is raw material, like it. So the materiality and the raw material, there is a difference that raw material hasn't been touched by the labor. It hasn't been modified at all. It is just there as the raw material, and then this particular combination of all the things, that is what Shambhumitra is like, to take that, to see the raw material, and in that perhaps the utility of it.
Yeah, but that's a metaphor. This is the last thing I'll say because this is getting just too much between two of us. But this is a metaphor. This raw material is a metaphor. It is not the same thing as what Marx is writing. Because when Marx is writing about labor working about raw material, the raw material is something which is transformed. So raw material will lose its earlier form to become something else. This is not true of a work of art. Of course, in certain stone will become sculpture. That's a totally different thing. In that sense, obviously raw material. But when you take a play, now it will change its element. It will change its medium. So the play will be written down as a literary script, and it will go to the stage and people will speak it. But that's not raw material. That's only a kind of translation. Raw material would be if Shambhumitra were to rewrite the play. Shambhumitra would take some of the ideas from the play, some lines from the play, and then, which people have done. A lot of other people have done. But that's what I'm calling indiscernible. The play remains exactly what it is, more or less. Of course, there is editing and all that, but more or less. So it is raw material in a metaphoric sense. But it's not raw material in the strict sense.
I don't think I agree with you.
Yeah. So basically, you are talking here about two forms, two art forms. One is play and the other is play. Performed play.
Yeah.
So, when we are just combining both of them, then of course, this change cannot be seen in that way. But otherwise, the raw material in a form of a written play, can be transformed. Or the play also,
you must,
in other form.
No, you must still try, at least I must understand what I'm saying. That a raw material is something which is transformed by an instrument so that a product is eventually the product of the raw material and the labor that goes into it, and the result is a certain value. So there is a result and there is what is called the labor process. Yeah? So it's a very strict process of something which exists as a raw material, gets transformed, eventually in a particular social system, capitalist system, it gains a value which is expressed in a completely different form like money or something. Now, if you draw it as a material, as a metaphor, then raw material would be what? That the place there as something which is a material for speaking, for showing, for ideas to be transmitted. It would go through the directorial and actorial process of the rehearsals, finally come to the audience, and the audience's receiving of it would be the kind of result. This would be a linear way of looking into it. But it is not the same thing at all, no. Because in the very name, when you say that it's Rakta Karabi, then you already, in the raw material, you can't say that this is a table which will become a table. You will say this is wood, this is tree, this is, something which is of a different, absolutely from a different domain and will become a table. You don't say that about a strict literary work becoming a play, unless of course it is not an adaptation. It's not like that. It's something which is just been taken as literally a kind of, a kind of laboratory material which can then be used to make combinations and recombinations. Many heterogeneous things can be put together. That's not the way Shambhu does Rakta Karabi, and Ritwik Ghatak, you quoted, points it out, that it is the exact play. So this is the thing, the identity, the ontological identity apparently is the same, it is the play. And yet something to the problem of art here, something indiscernible and yet distinct has happened. This wouldn't be true if we took an avant-garde production where you could take Greek tragedy, you could take a film, you could take 10 things and make a new thing out of it. That's a totally different, that's raw material. This is not that case. This is an artistic and ontological identity, as if there is Rakta Karabi, Tagore's Rakta Karabi. And yet, in the history of the production of Rakta Karabi, there is a leap in the sense that I am saying that at one point, it doesn't have a dramaturgy, at another point, the play is done, and in a way, history begins. The history of the production of Rakta Karabi. So, in that sense, the metaphor of raw material works only up to a point, it seems to me. Only up to a point. Because the identity is already given to you, that it's Rakta Karabi. It is already that table, and yet the table becomes in a completely new way. As different from labor, which works on a raw material and makes a table where no table existed. So labor, I was doing this in a different context. Labor is a kind of positing of the table, like Hegel would say. It's a negation of the wood and making of the table. That is not the case with, it's not a dialectic like that, no, between Tagore's Rakta Karabi and Shambhu Mitra's Rakta. So that is what I have in mind. Yeah.
To wind up with the next session. So we have a roundtable discussion. We'll take a short break, 10 minutes, and we can take up the questions then. Questions that we have for Bhabo.